Is it time to return to 6v6? I'm going to be talking about the state of 5v5, 6v6 points that are being discussed by content creators, by community members, whether it's on Reddit or the Overwatch forums, on YouTube, on Twitch, all that type of good stuff. And then I'm going to give my own take on it, on what I prefer, 5v5, 6v6, and is it time to return or not. So before I get into the video, everybody quickly look at this statistic over here. More than half of you are coming back to watch the video, but not all of you are subscribed. Guys, if you're coming back, you're watching the content, you enjoy everything that I do on this channel, or just this particular video, and if you're a big 6v6 enthusiast, then hit subscribe, because you might like what I might have to say in this video. And of course, all support is appreciated, whether you're helping me out with the algorithm by liking or commenting, or if you're supporting the channel financially through super chat and other means. With that being said, the intro is done, and let's get straight into the video. Okay, so let's talk about some 6v6 points. I'm going to be doing this mostly with a small little notepad over here that I have, where I wrote some points, and the rest is going to be improv. So let's go. So back in 6v6, there were certainly some ups and downs. I'm going to be discussing those. There was always talks that, well, in 6v6, queue times were all over the place because nobody was playing tank. Tank was boring. And, this is a very interesting point to say something like nobody is playing tank and tank was boring. But let's try to actually dig into and here's the thing. We cannot view this from the highest levels of play. We have to consider the player base that is pretty much like in the, let's say, metal ranks all the way up to maybe masters, right? This is the majority of the Overwatch players, and we have to consider some of their frustrations and why maybe they were not playing the game. So let's talk about the 6v6 points. So the point is, well, nobody was playing tank, and tank was boring, and tanks were unfun, and they were unfun to also play against because of how powerful they could be. Now, my only response to this type of points that is being made, all over the place in the Overwatch community is, well, this is all dependent on hero design. For example, even till this day, fighting up against a Reinhardt in Winston doesn't necessarily feel as bad as let's say, fighting up against a 𝐒𝐈𝐓𝐄𝐑, or even to a certain extent, you could argue the current iteration of Roadhog. They just feel so frustrating to shoot at because they can just feel like they will never die. However, against a Reinhardt or Winston, it feels like a pretty fair matchup where the Ryan or Winston player has to be very smart and strategic with their moves, while a character like 𝐒𝐈𝐓𝐄𝐑 and Roadhog can just kind of turn their brain off, walk it down mid, right? My point basically over here is this has more to do with hero design and making a hero feel fun to play with and against, also play that hero. And these are just some design choices where Overwatch has kind of failed. One of them is definitely 𝐒𝐈𝐓𝐄𝐑. Another one is the newly reworked Hog with the healing on a resource meter and everything. So I guess another one you could argue is also the old Rissa. I remember when she would put the shield down and you would just like get so frustrated because it was just Orisa cycling between fortify shield, and if she had a Sigma with her, double shield was unfun to play against too. And that brings me to my next point, right? Is in 6v6, there's points brought up by other content creators and other people within the community, on Reddit, on forums, and all this type of stuff. I'm not actually calling anybody out here. It's just something I've seen mentioned quite a bit. Is people say that, well, the problem with 6v6 was mostly double shield. This has nothing to do with the rest of the comps that could have been created. People were willing to work around those comps and even play with those comps. People didn't like shields being all over our face. And you know what? I'm actually going to agree and say that yes, this is true. This is true that 100% Orisa could have been reworked. 100% potentially even Sigma could have been reworked. Maybe he saw his shield being removed and being given some form of a lifesteal or some other ability to kind of help him stay alive, or maybe he wouldn't even need it, with the 6v6 and the fact that healing has gotten so strong over time as well. My point essentially is the problem with 6v6, especially at the end of its lifespan, was that the ability to stay alive, whether it was stacking shields or very, very high healing, is what caused the death of that game. Yes, you could argue that Blizzard wasn't supporting the game, and you are 100% correct, but from a player-based standpoint, the frustrations of playing Overwatch was that anything you shot at just had one way or another, especially tanks and supports, to somehow mitigate your damage, and the DPS role, or if you as a tank or support were trying to play more aggressive and apply the damage, it just felt like you were wasting your time, so that the fights just kept getting drawn out. So again, I have a solution for this, and I'm going to discuss at the end of the video. So another thing that is also brought up is people talk about, the tank synergies, and when tank synergies were working together, they were very oppressive But I actually want to throw in an additional point over here, is that something that people don't necessarily talk about is that support synergies were just as oppressive in 6v6 as they are in 5v5. If anything, I'd even argue right now that the biggest problem with the player base, I've been saying this on streams for a while now, that a lot of people don't actually pay attention to support synergies. And like when you have like supports just working together and understanding how to utilize their kits together to the max potential, their ability to control a game can be very oppressive. So back to the topic of, were tanks, could tanks feel oppressive to play against? Yes, for sure. On King's Row, when it came down to it, playing against a Ryan Zarya versus Ryan Zarya literally just felt like your Godzilla and Kong versus their Scar King and Shimu. It was it was fun to watch as a support player, as a DPS player, to see them duke it out while you did your own thing on the side to complement them, or maybe secure a pick here and there. But were they oppressive? I wouldn't necessarily call it oppressive. I would say that there were definitely some forms of oppressive compositions. However, they were not that bad to deal with until we got to the double shield era of the game, where Orisa and Sigma's synergies together and their ability to constantly find a way to look out for the other tank, make up for each other's weaknesses, was insane. And their ability to multitask was also insane. So again, this is more of a hero design issue rather than the actual format issue, which is 6v6. Now we have a point that I do agree with, and I do believe that there's a lot of rose tinted glasses over here when people talk about it, where they're like, you know what, counter picking is not as bad in 6v6 as it was in 5v5, especially for the tanks. I'm going to actually draw the line over here, and anybody who was playing it, I play a lot with my friends. I'm kind of done with competitive Overwatch. I'm going to be doing a video on this as well and explaining my thoughts about the current state of competitive, and why I'm very disappointed. Maybe it's just my own server issue, but that aside, um, there was a tank synergy, tank composition issue that, for example, if you had the wrong tanks, you had pretty much lost. I'm going to keep it 100% real. I played a lot of tank in 6v6, and I had a tank duo. We played Winston Diva, we played double shield, we played Ryan Zar, things like that. And anytime when we were climbing the ranks and we ran into something like a Diva Hog or some weird composition like Hog Winston or whatever, both of us knew that that game was pretty much GG's, and we would legit steamroll those lobbies, right? We would legit steamroll those lobbies because both those tanks are just completely all over the place, not working together. Their kits don't make sense in terms of working together. And while, yes, you had two big bodies that could somewhat soak up the damage, that was essentially all that their purpose was. For example, I would play Zarya and my mate would play Reinhardt, and if we were, let's say, up against a Diva Hog, all I had to do was just farm charge off of the bubbles, and then we would just decimate the Diva with the Zarya beam, and then the Hog was just easy Earth Shatter and Graviton Surge farming. So there was definitely a problem with, again, compositional issues in terms of that. Yes, there was a counter picking problem back there too, but I guess you could argue that it wasn't that bad because it wasn't as how do I say this? It wasn't as prominent as it is now. Like, you couldn't notice it back then because at the end of the day, you still had two people that split the damage, split the cooldowns that they could eat and take onto their face. So maybe, while in some cases they did stick with the damn, we got the Diva Hog, what are we going to do? How do we attack over here? And that was one of the worst feelings to get. Nowadays, when you exit on spawn and you're on Winston, and let's say your tank is on Winston and they come out on Mauga, you pretty much accept that first team fight, unless your DPS or supports can instantly get two picks to swing the fight in your favor immediately. This fight is not going to go your way because that Mauga is going to destroy the Winston. So yes, I will say that 6v6 did also have a quote-unquote counter picking or tank composition problem, but I guess you could argue that it was not as prominent or as much of a big deal until we got to 5v5, because at the end of the day, you could still, in very, very minor cases, I'm not going to exaggerate this, but very, very minor cases, you could get away with playing the wrong tanks. If those tanks, let's say your Diva and Hog, were like super good mechanically and they understood the game and how to do their thing and get value, you could get somewhat away with it. However, nowadays in 5v5, that is definitely much harder to do. So for sure, I agree that in this case, 6v6 does win another point on my part, that yeah, you know what, even though if you had the wrong tank comp, you could somewhat get away with it, albeit that it wasn't going to happen that much, but you could in some cases get away with it with the right people on the right role, right? However, nowadays in 5v5, unless your tank is the flavor of the month, you are not going to get away with one tricking or even two tricking certain tanks, right? Anyways, one thing I wanted to discuss about 6v6 and 5v5 that I noticed that perhaps maybe isn't talked about as much is 6v6 really felt like, and this is excluding double shield, 6v6 felt more like a game that really puts the idea of being more proactive rather than being reactive, right? And that is something that I feel like isn't being discussed enough. Is back in 6v6 it was all about just kind of going in rather than kind of waiting around for a mistake to happen. Yes, in if you're defending, and yes, if you're trying to play slower and everything, you are trying to react more, but the frequency of how many times you were playing more reactive and playing more proactive, proactivity was much higher than reactivity. In 5v5 it just really feels like everybody has to play super safe, and anybody that sticks their head out to try and make some proactive play just gets blown up by the other 5 people playing really slow, and then and only then can you be allowed to play proactively. And I really hate this part of 5v5, so I'm not a big fan of it. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that especially projectile DPS characters have lost a lot of power in the current state of the game, and only really hit scans can somewhat be proactive, but even then DPS just feels cosmetic yet again. I'm coming back to this point a little bit later. And again, I was discussing, queue times, that, well, nobody was playing tank. Well, of course, at the end of the day, if you're going to have a lot of the unfun tanks be meta, if you're not, like, Blizzard as a whole didn't understand what people enjoyed to play, and things in the game that were strong were either really boring to play or just unfun to play as, then of course you're going to have a subsection of your community not play that role. This is something that should be understood by now. I think, yes, there are people that enjoy the, off meta characters and everything, but there are certain characters that just cannot be meta. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit later as well. So moving on to the 5v5 arguments and points and ups and downs, as a tank, you definitely have more control over the game, and this goes to DPS and supports too. Of course, when you cut off one more player, anything that you might do, whether you land a big fat anti with Ana, whether you get a creative roadhog hook elimination on somebody, or your tracer picks off 1 or 2 in the backline, it's going to matter a lot more. That is for sure, which in turn, when doing so, does feel good and a lot more rewarding than it would feel in 6v6. However, the exact opposite of it feels just as bad, that in 5v5, if you're the one that got picked off, or you're the one that was on the receiving end of this, you get the immediate frustration that, damn it, I can't do anything. Like, this is a horrible feeling, right? So, counter picking, as we spoke about, is much more prominent now than before, especially if you have a tank that does not swap. For example, like we spoke about before, if you have the Winston that is refusing to swap and he keeps, like, bashing his head into the wall that is 𝐒𝐈, you're going to have a very, very rough time in being able to win that game. Not only is the enemy 𝐒𝐈 building his ultimate so quickly, but your Winston has no momentum going into any of these fights, and he clearly doesn't understand that this is not the hero to play here. And if he doesn't swap, then the chances of you winning is very, very low, and that leads into a lot of frustration for both people that are playing with that Winston, and for the Winston player himself, that he cannot get away with playing what he wants. But to be fair, despite how much Overwatch might lie to the player base and say that you can get away with playing whatever you want, that's not true. You have to somewhat play the characters that are strong, and in very, very few circumstances where you might be able to get away with characters that might be weak in a matchup basis, right? So yeah, so this is a big problem, especially since the tank is the sole recipient of all important cooldowns, whether it will enable or disable a play. Hence, what happens is that in turn, it makes tank less fun to play, thus leading into queue times being lowered, thus we run into the same queue times problem with what we have now, that again tank is the least played role, but for completely different reasons. So now the argument is, well, let's go back to 6v6, let's take the you know the new designs that the Balance team has come up with, and let's apply this current philosophy into 6v6 and try to make a better game. Now, what is my final, like, thoughts on all of this? Is it time to return to 6v6 or 5v5, right? I've talked about a lot of things, and this is my conclusion on all of this, right? I don't care which format that we're in, whether we're in 5v5 or 6v6, because the problems that I see either format running into is the same thing over and over again. Is, number one, supports get unbelievably powerful abilities, or healing is the strongest that I've ever seen in any video game. And I've been playing a lot of other PvP games on the side. Overwatch by far has the strongest healing values that I've ever seen in a game, with how much they can override damage, right? And most importantly, in order for the tank role to feel better and fun, tank busting related characters need to be weak in order to ensure the long-term health of a tank player base. What do I mean by this? Characters like Bastion, Torbjorn, and to a very limited extent Reaper should not be allowed to be meta. Or okay, well, to be fair, Reaper is a lot more honest and fair than, let's say, Torbjorn or Bastion, who are all about just instantly deleting high HP targets, right? The same also goes over to, let's say, an argument could be made about Roadhog, but I'm honestly, I'm a bit like 50-50 on Roadhog, so I'll ignore him for now. But Mauga is one of those characters that we have all seen as a community, that when he becomes viable, the person that like hates to play against Mauga, like your DPS and supports can somewhat avoid him and play around him to a limited extent, but your tank cannot, because Mauga just runs up to your tank and holds two buttons and it's GG's. It doesn't matter what tank you're playing, you are going to have a very rough time unless you either take the mirror or you play a very, very picture perfect, perhaps Orisa or Roadhog or Azaria, or just something where you pray to God that you can stay alive long enough for where your DPS can help get rid of this Mauga. But it is not a fun experience, and thus less and less people are going to play the tank role. So we've identified that there's a few core problems in the game that stand out like sore thumbs, right? It is not the format, it is 100% hero design. After everything that we've spoken about today, right? Overwatch's balance team, Alec Dawson's led balance team, they've been doing some good things recently, but they also need to understand some, some community sentiments. And this is also something that from the support community POV that they have to understand too, is number one, support shouldn't be allowed to have such override based abilities that can completely shift a fight, whether it's in the winning favor or the losing favor. Suzu, Immortality Field, Nade, these are all very, very powerful abilities. I'm sure I might have missed one or two, but Discord Orb as well. You know, it just, the list goes on. Like, I'm okay if we tone down the power of Discord Orb, and to be honest, Discord Orb has been put in a relatively better-ish spot since Zenyatta is a lot more flankable again by DPS, so that certainly helps. But these abilities that I mentioned, the more override based abilities like Immortality Field, Suzu, and Ana's Nade, since it does kind of like override your ability to be healed anymore, these are the type of abilities in the game that we really need to tone down. I've already suggested that the best way to rework Suzu and Immortality Field is number one, remove the invulnerability frame from Suzu. She does not need it. Keep the cleanse and then buff up the burst healing. This way Kiriko maintains her power. She can do good burst healing, reduce the cooldown just a little bit, and allow Kiriko to feel a lot more proactive and let the cooldown be a little bit more forgiving so she can use it more often. This way Kiriko feels more fun to play, right? Moving over to Baptiste, turn the Immortality Field. You can keep the name Immortality Field, but make it a damage reduction field and give it like a really high damage number value, whatever you want, but allow enough damage to pierce through so that it doesn't feel bad. Because when Immortality Field goes up, and if you're dueling a Baptiste or his team comp, the thing I hate about Immortality Field is that it forces you to look at it. So again, this is again a hero design problem that we are seeing now in 5v5 rather than, in 6v6 as well. So again, it's all about hero design. If we're unable to bring in 9 hero design concepts and making the game more fun to play, it's always going to feel bad. And let's be honest, Baptiste does not need the Immortality Field. He has insane AoE healing potential with his shift and right clicks, doing high AoE healing, and pair that up with another character like Kiriko or Suzu, and like seriously, do I need to explain how oppressive it can be to play against like a really good like duo of Bap Kiri or Bap Lucio? It feels almost impossible to deal with them, right? Because of how good they are once you understand their mechanics and the way to play these characters. So we have to nerf some of these overpowered support abilities and just slightly, I again say this, slightly turn down healing, because they already nerfed the DPS passive. So it's either they buff the DPS passive just a little bit again, so it feels like you can actually be more proactive. Because right now, just the game just kind of feels like season 8 again, which like hug your tank, pray to God that you got the better tank matchup, and then go win the game. This is boring. I don't like this. I want to be able to go do whatever I want on DPS, or if I want to play a more aggressive style of support, I want to be able to do that. Or even if I just want to play more aggressive style of tank. I hate playing tank. Like I just have to either counter pick or just wait until the other tank makes a mistake and then play the game. It gets really boring to play Overwatch like that, and that's kind of why like I'm like kind of done with competitive. It just I don't see Overwatch doing enough to make competitive feel better and the matchups feel better. The game feels really fun to play with friends when you play it like in a semi-competitive, semi-casual sense. From that POV, it's completely fine, but trying to take this game like super seriously nowadays is just, it's just not going to do good for you. So unless you're really trying hard to go pro, maybe as a player for yourself, you should try to aim for maybe Masters or Diamond. And outside of that, honestly, just enjoy the game for what it is. You know, that's just my advice. Anyway, so back to the solution, right? Back to the solution. Nerfing OP support abilities, toning down the healing just a little bit, whether we increase the damage passive or nerf healing just a little bit in general. My final solution is, again, talking about tanks. I know this video I've talked about tank a lot because this is the role that's being affected the most. DPS and supports can get away with it regardless of the format. Tank is the #1 talking point behind 5v5 and 6v6, right? My biggest solution that I've been saying for months now, and I said this many videos now, is that tank buster characters should not be viable for tank to feel fun to play, right? At the end of the day, when you're playing tank and you get outplayed fairly by another tank or DPS or whatever, it's okay. You feel good about it. You're like, you know what? Okay, fine, they outplayed me. But when they pick one character and that one character just completely eviscerates you from the planet, this is where tank feels like less fun to play. And let's be a little bit realistic here. This type of like gameplay feeling is not necessarily felt on support or damage as much as it is felt on the tank role. So in regards to them, to make that role feel better to play, because look, I'm being fair to all three roles. I've talked about DPS, talked about support, and talked about tank as well, right? In order for tank to feel better as a role, regardless whether we go to the 5v5 or 6v6 format, we must ensure that characters that make playing tank a nightmare get toned down. And this is why Aaron Keller's or Alec Dawson's balance philosophy on trying to make every hero viable is just not going to work. In my personal opinion, Overwatch needs to stay an unbalanced game. It needs to be balanced from the skill to value ratio, and they really need to double down on this sooner than later, especially since certain characters right now that are running rampant are, let's be real, a bit low skill. And only then will the game start to feel better to play and more enjoyable to learn and even more fun to grind and competitive. Seriously, like on a side note, mini rant, like, right? I was actually taking comp very seriously in season 9 in the beginning because it felt really good to play and I was playing all three roles. But with the way that they've kind of reverted and changed up everything, I just feel like I'm back in season 8. Like nothing feels different. Like nothing, it just feels boring again. It just feels like nothing is dying. The game is just slow again. I really hope they can turn it around in season 10 because season 10 does look to be very promising, and season 9 for its first 3 weeks was very promising too. Anyways, everybody, that's it for this video. It was a little bit all over the place. I myself have been all over the place doing a plethora of university exams. I'm legit in my final months of my master's degree. So videos and everything is all over the place. I would really appreciate any support that you guys can give to keep this channel alive, as well as any financial support that you want to send my way. With that being said, I will see you guys in the next video where tomorrow 100% we will be doing the best Moira guide.